Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Samantha Clark, and I work at Quest Nature Tours. Thank you for joining us today. Here with me is Martyn Obbard, an emeritus research scientist and the former resident bear biologist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and adjunct professor at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. His field work focuses on polar bears and black bears, and he has published many papers detailing the demographics, genetics, and movements of these species. On top of everything, Marty is a tour leader for Quest Nature Tours. He plans to travel in 2021, leading 2 tours, a Svalbard Explorer Adventure Cruise, and up to Churchill, Manitoba to see the polar bears. Today, Marty will be sharing compelling stories of some of the individual bears he came to know well over years of studying them, and show us how they revealed to him some fascinating aspects of their life. Please take it away, Marty.
Thanks, Samantha. Well, hi everybody, and welcome to our webinar looking at some of the bears that I came to know over the years studying them in Ontario. So for those of you who don't know me, I was a research scientist working with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, and I studied black bears and polar bears in Ontario from 1989 until 2016, so for 28 years. And today, I thought that maybe we'd have a little fun. I'd relate some of the stories about bears, most of which will be true, at least they'll be believable, I hope. And yeah, we'll just, rather than a hard-hitting information presentation, this will be more about some of the experiences I had with bears and some of the bears that I learned a lot from over the years. So black bears and polar bears, of course, are very different animals. Polar bears are pretty aggressive. They can actually hurt you. Black bears are a lot less aggressive. And so it requires very different approaches. In the shot on the top left, you can see that's me hanging out of the helicopter about to dart that polar bear. So a lot of the work we did with polar bears was more remote compared to that we did with black bears, where in that top right photo you can see that I'm standing outside of a black bear den. So often we were up close with black bears, a lot more so than with polar bears, and that affected the kinds of things that we learned actually over the years. So this first bear is a big male bear, was part of the study that we had in the boreal forest near Chapleau. So I actually had 3 long-term studies on bears in the province. One in the boreal forest near Chapleau, ran for over 10 years. We had another study on the Spruce Peninsula that ran partly overlap with that boreal forest study. And then the last long-term study I had was in Algonquin Park. So I looked at bears in 3 very different parts of the province. So this guy was nicknamed early on in our boreal forest study in the early 90s by our grad students and summer students working on the project as Scarface. And I think you can see how he got his name. He has lots of scars. I'm having an issue with my mouse here, Samantha. But over his rostrum, you can see that he's got lots of old claw marks where he's been in fights with other bears. He also has a puncture wound in the top of his nostril. So he got that also in a fight with another male. And what are males fighting over? Well, they're fighting over access to females because they want the breeding opportunities. They want to leave young behind them in the population. So this guy, Scarface, was a really interesting bear. He showed up when we did our genetic studies as the father of cubs in several litters over the years. Obviously a big male and a proven breeder. And in those fights that he was involved with, he must have been the successful one in most of those fights because he got access to the female. That hole in the top of his nose and his nostril there was interesting. If we had caught him in a big trap, he would huff and blow at us, and you can imagine what came out of that third hole as well at the same time. So here's another bear. This is a young male, so very different from Scarface. You see that his nose is not scarred up. He's only about 5 or 6 years old. hasn't been, while he's producing sperm, so physiologically he's mature. He's not a big enough bear to actually win breeding opportunities. And so he's not beat up. If he got in any fights with other bears, he's quickly just turned and run and not ended up in a scrap. So one of the things that I realized early on, when I first started studying bears, I was in a support position. I worked with my predecessor for 3 or 4 years before he retired. And I realized early on, I didn't know a whole lot about bears. I knew their basic biology, but I didn't know a whole lot about bear behavior. And so I started really studying them when I had time off in the evenings or sometimes in the middle of the afternoon. I would go to a small landfill that we had near us, and I would watch the bears and watch how they interacted with each other and try to learn their language, as it were. And so over the years, what I learned was they have a whole suite of signals that they use against other bears. So they're trying to keep other bears at a distance often. They can live in a pretty violent world. They want to avoid confrontations if they can. And it turns out they use the whole suite of signals for bears that they use with us. So if you learn what those signals are, you can actually go a long way to understanding the interactions that you have with bears themselves. So this fellow is chilling out on top of a bank of sand. He's totally relaxed, paws are crossed. He's really only looking at the photographer out the side of his eye. Now in the left-hand picture here, you see that I've approached a little bit closer, so he's a little bit concerned. He's lifted up, his ears are raised, his ears are a little bit back. He's still pretty chilled out, but he's aware of my presence and getting closer. On the right-hand side, you can see that now he's actually quite concerned. He's sat up and he's starting to show signs of stress. And Samantha, are you on? I can't seem. Here we go. Okay, thanks. Got it back. What I want to do now is have you listen to some vocalization that a bear that's starting to get stressed would make, and hopefully you'll hear this. So that's called moaning. No surprise there, I suppose. And that's the bear on the right. So he's giving some fairly low-level indications of being stressed, but he's trying to convince me that he's uncomfortable with my presence and he would like me to back up. So this next bear is a much larger bear. And similarly, I've approached him to see what his reaction would be. You can see he's a much larger bear. He's very muscular in his front end. He's a big male, actually, probably 400 pounds or more. And if you look at closely at the picture, you'll see his left paw is somewhat buried in the sand. So what he's actually done is he's huffed at me, gone like that, and swatted the ground, and dust would fly up. And he again is trying to discourage me from getting any closer. He's telling me that he's not happy with my presence. And this is kind of the noise that he was making. So that's a noise that black bears make in their throat. It's a real guttural noise. They make it when they're in close encounters with each other, perhaps if they're competing for a food source in a berry patch or something, when they're trying to get another bear to stay back. But I think you're getting the idea, hopefully getting the idea now of increasing levels of stress that the bears are demonstrating. And if you pay attention to what they are, then you can learn how to reduce your conflict with bears. So this next picture is a small adult female bear that was at the side of one of the gravel roads in our study area one day. And I stopped to get some pictures of her and intentionally pushed her a little bit to get reaction from her. She had cubs that she had chased up a tree behind her, and so she was defending those cubs. And here are the noises that she made. So that's called huffing and blowing, and that's the next higher level of stress response by a bear. So the bear is going, and it's clacking its molars together like that. And when you hear a bear doing that, you are way too close, and you probably should have backed up a few minutes ago. If you don't back up, if instead you push the bear, as I did, the next thing that happens is a flat-out charge. So if you imagine all this sequence of displays being given by a single bear as it tried to convince you that you were too close and it wanted you to back up. At any place along there, if you had paid attention to the bear signals and backed off, you would have reduced that stress in the bear, and you would have avoided the conflict. So this picture is the beginning of the bear charging, and the next couple I took were out of focus, for some reason, so we won't worry with those. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of bear language and the kinds of signals that black bears give people, grizzlies as well, by the way. And you better pay a lot more attention to grizzly bears than you do to black bears. Fortunately, we don't have grizzlies in Ontario. So this is another bear. This is another young male, and he also was given a nickname by the summer students. He was a pretty chilled young bear, and he was nicknamed the Slickster. So the Slickster was pretty entertaining. He would often be seen at the side of the road or sometimes at a small landfill that was near our study site. And you could see him. And you learned as you watched bears like this that they must get bored. Here he is, he's playing with a sapling, a whole sequence of photos where he's rubbing up against it, pulling on it, lies back, bends it down, kind of chews at it a little bit. He may have actually, this is an aspen in the spring, so he may well have taken some of the leaves to eat, but mostly he's just playing with this tree. So he's a pretty interesting character, old Slickster, or young Slickster rather. But we followed him for several years as he got older and older in the study. But he was one of the favorites of our summer students at the time. So one thing that I learned fairly early on while I was working with black bears is that female black bears are wonderful mothers. The bond between the cubs and the mother is really tight. She defends them vigorously. This is a female with 3 yearlings. So black bear cubs are born in January, typically. They stay with their mom for about 18 months. By the way, if you can hear grinding noise in the background, that's my dog. He's got a brand new bone. I tried to encourage him to go out to the front living room, but he decided he needs to lie right behind my chair and chew this new bone. So that's Sammy. Anyway, back to the bears. So black bear cubs are born in January. They stay with their mom for about 17 or 18 months, which means that female bears have cubs female black bears have cubs every 2 years if they're able to have cubs successfully. So every 2 years at most. Average litter size in Ontario is about 2.5. So half the females have 2 cubs, half the females have 3. And this female has got 3 yearlings. This is early in the spring. So these yearlings are probably about 16 months old already, maybe a month away from breaking up from mom. And she's been a very successful female because she probably had 3 cubs. She may have had 4, but more likely 3. And she's raised them all to yearling age. So pretty impressive. And they listen to her. She vocalizes and talks to them, chases them up trees when there's danger, or calls them to her. Right now she's crossing the road, and if she happened to see traffic coming, she'd call to them pretty quickly and get them off the road. This next picture is a young male, one of our radio collared young males. You can see, I think you can see the radio collar on his neck. And again, this is in about late May or early June of the year. And what he's doing, I happened to come along him. I was driving along a bush road and happened to see him. And what he was doing was he was marking in that jack pine. So he stood up, first of all, and he dragged his claws down the sides of the jack pine, making the sap run. And then he actually climbed up the jack pine a little bit and scratched up there. So what males are doing at this time of year is they're leaving sign behind for other males and for females, presumably. So they scratch in the bark of conifers, mostly spruces and jack pine, and then they turn their back to the tree and they rub their shoulders like this into the sap that is now running down the bark of the tree. They leave hair behind, and that's a marking system. So they're marking for other males to say that they're in the area, or for females in part to attract females. So this young bear is doing the same thing. Now he's not big enough to get mating opportunities, but still it demonstrates what males do at that time of year. So another interesting thing that came to light over the years as we studied bears in the boreal forest. So this next picture takes us to about mid-June. And in this photo, this is a large adult female bear. She was 14 at the time, as I recall. She'd had cubs at age 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. So she had 5 litters. She was a very successful female. She always had either 2 or 3 cubs and raised them, most of them, all the way through to yearling stage. It doesn't show up very well in this photo, but right here, that's her vulva, and it's pink and enlarged, and she's dumping pheromones out into the environment because she's receptive. So this is June of the year. About a month ago, she chased her yearlings away because now she is receptive and she's going to want to mate again. The other bear in the picture is a young male. He's about 6 or 7 years old. So he's physiologically mature and he wants to mate with this female. But what I learned watching pairs of bears like this is that there's female choice in the bear world. The females decide who they want to mate with. Males don't have fancy sport cars, of course, or big bank balances to impress the females. So what they have is their physical size. So what happens is that couples like this engage in wrestling matches. The male tries to impress the female by overpowering her, and the female resists. She assesses the male's quality, as it were, based on his physical stature. And with this couple, I watched them over a couple of days, and the male repeatedly tried to overpower the female, whip her on behind her to mate. And whenever he did that, she stopped it by simply sitting down. And then on about the third day that I saw them together, along came Scarface. Scarface took a run at the young male. The young male said, "Oh, I'm out of here." The young male was gone, and within about an hour, Scarface and this female, bear 13, bear 32, they were mating, and subsequently Scarface was the father of her cubs of the following winter. So females assess the quality of the males. They decide who they want to mate with, and it's based on physical stature. So if you're a male bear, you want to leave cubs behind in the population. You need to achieve large body size by the time that you're able to overpower females like this. So that typically, when you're about 8 to 10 years old, 8 would be minimum, probably 8 to 10 to 12 years old is the peak of breeding by male black bears. And so you need to have pretty rapid growth while you're a young bear in order to achieve that large body size. Otherwise, you just won't be successful. So if a female chooses a large male, chances are that her male cubs fathered by that male will also have large body size, because growth rates like that are inherited. So I think you can see why it's an advantage to the female to choose a large male, because her male offspring are then also going to be successful breeders, and the females will almost always be successful. Okay, so now on to a slightly different topic. One of the things that we studied in all the 3 studies that I had going, long-term studies, was exactly what do bears feed on, and how variable is that within a season and among years. So this first bear is feeding at the roadside in the early spring. She's feeding on horsetails and grasses, and another really popular food item early in the spring is dandelions. This bear is really chowing down on dandelions. Non-native, of course, but still really important because they spread all the way across bear range. They'll also feed on suckers. They'll go into, in Ontario, they'll go into streams when the suckers are running in late May and fish for suckers. Important protein source, the first really important protein source of the spring. And here's another occasional protein source. This is my son Neil, who helped out one year when we had a study going in Algonquin Park where we were looking at survival of moose calves. So this is a young moose calf. We've got a radio collar on it. We're just about to release it. And we studied survival of moose calves in depth with a colleague, fellow research scientist named Brent Patterson from the ministry. And what we found was that between bears and wolves, somewhere between 10 and 12% of moose calves were taken by predators in the first year of life. Bears tried to get them when the calves were a month old or less. Once the calves were a month old, the bears had a really tough time catching them. The wolves would catch them later on in life. So bears do occasionally take moose calves. It's not very often that an individual bear does it, because they are opportunistic hunters. They wander widely through their home range during calving, and if they happen to encounter a calf, they might try it. But here's the other side of the story. And this demonstrates how dangerous it is for a black bear, for an adult female black bear at least, to try to take a calf. This is one of our adult females from our Chaplow study. And in late May one year, her radio collar all of a sudden went stationary. It wasn't moving around. So we knew that she'd either dropped the collar or perhaps she was dead. So a couple of summer students and I walked in, and we found her lying dead, lying beside a log, no visible signs of trauma on her, no signs of wounds, nothing. So we decided we'd better carry her out. And we ultimately got the body down to a friend and colleague of mine, a pathologist at the University of Guelph. So I traveled down when he was going to do the necropsy. And Doug, typical procedure, pulled the skin back. And as he did that, he said, boy, there's a lot of blood pooling on this one side. And I said to him, yeah, that's the side the bear was lying on. And that's normal, of course. The blood pools on the side that an animal, as it has just died, is lying on. Anyway, Doug said, no, this is more than that. There's some damage here. And so he opened up the sternum, and when he did that, he could see that several ribs had been were broken and had been driven in and actually punctured the lung. And so the cause of death was pneumothorax, a punctured lung. And when we looked at the shape of the bruising, the shape and size of the bruising on the side of the animal's rib cage was exactly the size of the hoof of a cow moose. And we knew that this bear had caught calves in previous years, at least twice. And so this time she wasn't lucky. The cow had defended that calf and pounded the bear with its front feet and ended up killing the bear. So that's the other side of that story. We did have one case where one of our radio-collared male bears actually killed a cow moose. And all of the signs suggested that, yes, in fact, he had done. I investigated the scene after it happened. We saw that he was stationary in one location, walked in to see what was going on, and he took off as we approached, but there was a carcass of a cow moose there. And when I reconstructed the scene, I could see where he had come upon the cow in a bed and startled her and then chased her. And we could see bear hair stuck to raspberries and moose hair and so on. And there was actually one place where there was a big spruce tree and a huge kind of semicircular scar at the bottom of the spruce tree, and moose hair and bear hair stuck in the bark. And so what I reasoned was that the cow had actually slammed against the spruce tree, trying to dislodge the bear because he had jumped on her and had hold of her. And the cow was unsuccessful, and he eventually brought her down and killed her. So yeah, so lots of interesting interactions between bears and moose. So the other aspect of what they feed on, this is the biggest bulk of the diet, of course, is various kinds of vegetation, mostly berries. And over the years, we monitored blueberry production in the boreal forest, and we found tremendous variation. Some years you might have as few as 10 kilograms per hectare of blueberries, sometimes none at all. Other years you might have 100 or almost 1,000 kilograms of blueberries. So their food is highly variable from one year to the next. Even things like pin cherries can be quite variable from one year to the next. Mountain ash is on about a 2-year cycle. This is a bear up in a mountain ash tree. Mountain ash has a good crop about every 2 years. And if the blueberry crop happens to fail, but there's a good mountain ash crop, then the bears can compensate. If both crops are really good, then the bears do really, really well. But if blueberry crop fails and it's an off year for mountain ash, then the bears are in real trouble. And female bears have what's called delayed implantation. So females mate, as I showed you the picture of bear 33, females mate in typically June, sometimes early July. So technically they're pregnant. The eggs get fertilized, they go through a few cell divisions, and then they float free in the uterus of the female until the fall. And if the bear has had access to lots of food and so is big and fat, then those zygotes will implant in the wall of the uterus, and active gestation will proceed. And active gestation is about 60 days. So if implantation happens in October, then I think you can see that's why most black bear cubs are born in early January. If it so happens that the female has not found a lot of food, maybe there's been a frost and there's been a failure of the blueberry crop or whatever, then active gestation will not happen. The zygotes will simply be resorbed, and it's all based on circulating lipid levels in the female's blood. So if lipid levels are really high, then that triggers a hormonal response, and those zygotes implant in the uterus. If lipid levels are really low, then a female passes up that opportunity. Okay, so next slide. This is actually a big male bear up a beech tree in Algonquin Park. And so they'll climb way up in beech trees. They sit up in them. They pull branches to themselves. Their lips are quite free from their skull, so they pull a branch through like this, strip those beech nuts off, kind of like baseball players with sunflower seeds. They chomp on the beech nuts for a bit, and then they spit out the husk, and then actually then swallow the nut itself. So beech nut is another crop that's really variable from one year to the next. So what was one of the things that we learned about all this variability? Well, we learned it has tremendous effect on human-bear conflict. And here's the only data slide I'm going to show you. These are sources of conflict between humans and bears. So we have, I can't actually see the logo in my view, but we had 3 sources of garbage. I think this one is domestic, this one is commercial, and this one is at landfills. And almost 2/3 of the conflicts that we have in Ontario between black bears and humans is because of garbage that's improperly stored. And if we could convince people to store their garbage properly in cottage country or wherever, we'd really dramatically reduce human bear conflict levels. And one thing that we learned over all these years studying bears, when there's a really abundant natural food, we have very low conflict levels because the bears are more interested in natural food. When the natural food fails, then they are attracted to human sources of food, mostly garbage. And they are tremendously persistent when they want to get at human sources of food. So this is a big male black bear, and he's going paw over paw, as it were, out this clothesline to get at this bird feeder. These are shots that were taken just south of Sudbury. You may have seen them on the internet, and then sometimes they're on the internet. Somebody says, oh, this was taken in New York, this was taken here, wherever. Well, they're actually from Ontario, and they were taken by a landowner just south of Sudbury several years ago. You can see that he eventually makes it there. Pretty persistent. And so if you have bird feeders out in the summer, you need to understand they're not bird feeders at all. They're more than likely bear feeders if you're in bear country. Okay, on to another character. So this is about we had 4 bears that got nicknames in our boreal forest study, and this was the first one. This was an old male. He was nicknamed Ben by our students. And Ben was probably 30 years or more older. He was the oldest bear I ever handled. And if you look at his right eye, you can see that he has a cataract in his eye. So when I first knew him back in 1989, he was one of the bears that I decided I needed to learn more about bear behavior from. And so I would approach him. He would give me all these warning signs, and I would ignore them, and I would approach him, and then he would ultimately charge. And so from Ben, I learned how to respond to bear signals, how not to respond to bear signals, so I could tell other people how not to respond. But also what I learned was, as big as he was and as aggressive as he could be, that his charges were bluff charges. He always stopped short. Now, if you have a bear this size, and Ben sometimes would be 500 pounds or more, and he runs at you full tilt, it can be pretty intimidating. And the first couple of times it happened, I was pretty intimidated. After that, I learned that he was always going to stop short. But I learned a lot from Ben. He was the king of this landfill when we first arrived at our study area in '89. He was the father of many cubs in that population. His genetics showed up in lots of the work that we did. And I have a couple of stories about him. One's actually quite tragic. So one year, a couple of years after we arrived at our study site, I was watching Ben at this landfill, and another male, a strange male, came along, and Ben challenged him. And this male was actually bigger than Ben. He was a longer bear. Ben may have weighed more, but he was getting old and probably a bit arthritic, out of shape. Anyway, they engaged in a sparring thing, and as males, big male bears sometimes do, they stood up and they kind of pushed at each other like this, and of course there's a lot of vocalizing going on. And they were thumping each other in the chest, and all of a sudden this strange bear whipped around to the side, and he bit at the side of Ben's left side of his head, and Ben let out this howl of pain and anguish. And the two bears were kind of connected for a while, and then the strange bear somehow disengaged, and Ben was moaning, and he ran off and lay down in the bush. And I thought he'd actually was going to die. And I sat there watching him, and he lay for almost an hour, panting and panting and panting, and then eventually he got up and wandered off. And about 2 weeks later, we happened to trap him because he had dropped his radio collar. I wanted to change his radio collar. And what I realized had happened was when this strange bear bit the left side of Ben's head, his canine had actually punctured Ben's eye. So no wonder it was painful. Anyway, after that, we used to say, or I used to say, that Ben was blind in his left eye and couldn't see out of his right eye because of the cataract. So in the following year, I happened to need to go drive into town. I had a meeting with the local district manager about logistics for the study. And as I was driving into town, just starting to leave camp, I saw this bear walking up the road towards me. And I watched him. I stopped the truck. I watched him for a second. And just the way he was walking, I thought, oh, that's Ben. And because he could no longer see out of his left eye and had this cataract in his right eye, he used to swing his head from side to side like this, I assume because he was trying to see around this cataract. Anyway, I thought, well, this will be interesting. So because he was walking right towards the truck. And poor old Ben didn't see the truck, walked right into the front of the truck, whoomp, like this, let out a snort, walked around the side of the truck, kind of looked at me out of the corner of his eye, and huffed and snorted at me, and off he went. So poor old Ben. This is Ben in sort of younger days when we first arrived in the study, when he was in a bit better shape and was king of the dump. And you can see the sign he's encouraging people not to feed the bears. And this is one of the last pictures I have of Ben. So every year in July, about somehow, he would lose some weight, and the collars that we put on males had breakaways on them. Ben would rip that collar off, and I would decide, well, I need to replace this collar. And so this year, I did replace his collar. And over 3 years that we had him radio collared in the fall, now remember that he had this cataract in this one eye, and the vitreous humor was gone from the other, so he couldn't use it at all. He would leave that landfill in about the 3rd week of August every year. And he would go about 20 kilometers across country somehow. And he ended up building a den within about 200 meters of last year's den. Amazing to think of how he navigated like that. Pretty amazing bear, one of my favorites. So I better speed up a bit here. So this is another bear. This is bear 16. This is bear 16 as a 6-year-old. Remember I mentioned about how bears need to grow really rapidly? Well, this guy was going through, as a 6-year-old, a really rapid growth cycle. So we happened to catch him in live traps about 4 or 5 times in one summer, as he was always going after the bait. A couple of years later, this is bear 16 as an 8-year-old. This is the only experience I had with a predatory bear. So I had known this bear for several years. I had seen him lots of times on the road. We had handled him many times in traps, a couple of times in the winter. I was out radio tracking one day and was getting a fix on another radio collared bear, and had stopped to have a cup of tea and a cookie, and looked up, and along came bear 16 walking along this bush road from behind. And he walked up past me, and I spoke to him, and he just kind of looked, and he kept on going and disappeared into the bush. So I needed to move down the road about 1 kilometer to get a cross bearing so I could get a good location on the bear I was following. I did that, and then I had my 3rd bearing, so I stopped. I was writing some notes, and out of the bush came bear 16. And he went ahead of the truck a little ways, and you can see he started feeding on clover. He's eating here, was selectively taking the clover flowers. So he's plucking these clover flowers and so on. I thought, wow, this is great. I got to get some photos. And so this is one of the photos I took using a long lens, but I was still quite close. And all of a sudden, he looked at me. And this is the last photo I had of him. And you can see that he's fixed on me completely. He's focused his whole attention on me. His whole demeanor changed. Instead of ignoring me as he had before, all of a sudden he became very, very interested, and he started to slowly approach. I thought, this doesn't feel right, doesn't feel good. So I backed up. I wasn't that far away from my truck. I backed up and I started to go around the truck. So for the life of me, I don't know why I didn't think of this, but I didn't think to hop into the truck, which of course is, part of the training that we subsequently would give people. But anyway, Bear 16 followed me, and we went around the truck, getting quicker and quicker, going around the truck about 3 times like this. And at one point, he stopped on the driver's side of the truck, and he stood up with his paws on the side rail like this, and I was on the passenger side of the truck. And as I was thinking, okay, how am I going to get out of this situation? And again, I still hadn't thought to just get in the truck. Anyway, I remembered something that Stephen Herrero, who wrote the original book on bear attacks, had said. Something Steve had said to me one day. We were chatting about predatory bears and incidents with humans. And Steve said, Marty, I'm convinced that if there's anything people can do to change a bear's train of thought early on in an encounter, they will get themselves out of it. I looked in the bed of the truck, and there was a long-handled shovel. I picked up that long-handled shovel, I reached over, and I whaled Bear 16 on top of the head as hard as I could. Now I hit him a second time. And all of a sudden, he just went like this. And you could see his whole facial expression changed. He was no longer all that interested, not focused on me like he had been. And he dropped down and he started to walk away, and I was yelling at him, and I ran after him. I hit him in the rump a couple times with the shovel, yelling, get out of here, this kind of thing. And off he went. And so I believe Steve was right, that if there's anything that someone can do in an early encounter with a predatory bear, and of course these days we recommend that people carry bear spray because it's proven effective. If there's anything you can do early on, you can get yourself out. Okay, so I'm almost wrapping up black bears here. This is a young female, about 7 or 8 years old, Bear 75. We followed her for many years during the study. This is in October. You can see that she's pretty well rounded in the rump. She's put on lots of weight. She's had a really good summer, and now she's looking for a place to build it in. The interesting thing about Bear 75 was that in most places in Ontario, female bears will start having cubs at 5. In the boreal forest, it may be 6 or 7, sometimes later. But this bear didn't have her first cubs until she was 10. And I think you can see that she's in really good shape. So in theory, she ought to have had cubs, but she didn't. And the hint I had from her was that there's probably some kind of chemical communication going on amongst the female bears in the population, and the older matriarchs in the population somehow suppress some of the younger females from breeding. Because their daughters generally stay home to their mother, close to their mother's home range, you would think that they would actually encourage their daughters. But maybe maybe her mother had died, and there was another female had come in, and somehow she was suppressed. Anyway, almost impossible to show that, rigorously to prove that, but it was an interesting idea that we came up with at the time. Anyway, ultimately, she did have cubs at age 10, a couple of years later. And these are a few pictures now of the typical den. This is an excavated den. You can see here that the female has dug a hole back into a bank. This is all the freshly excavated soil she's dug out. This is actually from the Spruce Peninsula study. This is mom here, mom's ear and mom's snout. And this is a yearling, been put back in the den. They're both have been drugged. They are now have had their reversal, and they're starting to recover. But that's a typical den in the Spruce Peninsula, where you have them denning down in the limestone, in small caves and so on in the limestone. Here's a typical den from someplace like Algonquin Park, where a young bear might den in a hollow hemlock like this. And here she is, sticking her head out, wondering what's going on. And not easy to drug without stressing the bear, but we managed to do it. Here's a more typical den from the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, where most of the disturbance happens from the blowdown of single trees or small groups of trees. And so we have a large diameter tree that's blown down. The trunk is lying this way. This is the root mass. And if you look closely in here, this is where the bear is. There's the bear. And this is all the bedding that she has hauled in and made a big, deep bed in there. And so she's protected from above by the trunk of the tree. And because most of these trees are blown down by northwesterly winds, the winds typically in the winter are going to blow from this direction that way. So the bear has protection from the prevailing winds a lot of the time as well. And here's your first look at a few young cubs. So another thing that I learned working with black bears is that if you get people out, in this case, of course, pretty famous person, if you get people out with you in the winter, you can often turn their attitude very positively towards bears, especially if you can get them out with a female and cubs. So very quickly, a couple of stories about yearlings. Yearlings stay with their mom, as I said, or bears stay with their mom, as I said, for about 18 months. This is a yearling in February from Algonquin Park following a really good food year. So this bear weighed somewhere between 25 and 30 kilos and was in really good shape. In contrast, this is a yearling from the boreal forest study in a year following a food failure. So this cub had been born in January of the previous year. In the summer of that year, there was a total food failure in the boreal forest. So mom had a lot of trouble providing enough milk for this bear to grow successfully. It's a smaller bear, it's shorter than the one I just showed you from Algonquin, but most importantly, this bear weighed 6 kilos instead of between 25 and 30, and it subsequently starved to death. So tremendous effect on survival of young bears based on what the food is like in that particular summer. And one last thing about black bears before we switch to polar bears. This is one of our females who came out of a trap. She'd been feeding extensively on blueberries, and I think you can see that yes, bears do go in the woods. In case you've had that burning question for years, do bears? Well, yes, they do. All right, let's switch gears entirely now to polar bears. As I mentioned, they're a very different approach required because they're potentially dangerous and also in far more remote areas. This is a young male on Agamesky Island in James Bay. So I studied polar bears all across the northern shore of Ontario and Hudson Bay, but also down into James Bay with colleagues from York University and Environment Canada and various places. And here I am in the helicopter. This is a helicopter we used for about the last 10 years of our study with a big sliding door, which gave really nice access for darting. And we're pursuing this bear, and we're going to try to put a dart into his neck, which is the preferred spot, because of course, the location of action is in the brain. So you want the blood to get to the brain pretty quickly with the drugs. So polar bears, if they could, they would spend their whole life out on the ice because that's where seals are. This is a picture from actually the middle of James Bay, south of Agamesky Island, in February one year when we were doing some aerial survey work. This is a bear that has been wandering around out on the ice. And this is a photo from the high Arctic of Canada up in Lancaster Sound from one of the Quest Northwest Passage trips a few years ago. This is a female, and cubs are out on a pan of ice. And she's got a cub cuddled up beside her and here. And over to the right here was the remains of a seal. So this was in August, and you can see that she's still out on the ice, and she would actually stay there. But not all parts of their range can polar bears stay out on the ice. In Hudson Bay, for example, in Davis Strait and other places, Baffin Bay, the ice melts completely every year, and that forces the bears ashore. And in Hudson Bay, pregnant females, as this one. This is a pregnant female in October. You can see that she's pretty big and fat, lots of fat storage. And she's heading inland looking to build a den. So in Hudson Bay, bears are forced ashore every year because the ice melts every year, and it has for at least 8,000 years. And one consequence of this time of year is because there's no food, the females are receptive in April, not in September and October. You often find groups of males hanging around together. There's nothing to compete over, and so they just hang out. You can see this close-up of this group of bears. These males are all in really, really good shape. So they've been off the ice. This was, I'm trying to remember exactly when this photo was taken, possibly mid-September. So these bears have been off the ice for about a month and a half. You can see that they're just hanging out together. I think you can also be impressed by the size of big male polar bears. The biggest male polar bear I ever handled was almost 1,500 pounds. Huge bear, very long, but also it was not long after he'd come off the ice. Okay, so with these two guys, there's a story. So this is me on the left in the photo, and the gentleman on the right, a fellow named Doug Holtby. He's a helicopter pilot I worked with from the ministry for many, many years. And these bears have been positioned like this on purpose for a photograph. We came across one day, when you're doing capture-recapture work, and you're trying to estimate the number of bears that there are in a population based on the number that you handle each year and comparisons among years, you're supposed to try and catch every bear that you see. Well, logistically, that's essentially impossible. But if you come across maybe 2 or 3 male bears on an offshore spit or a small island, you sometimes can do it successfully, especially if you have a good pilot. So this story doesn't relate to these 2 bears in particular, but it's an example. One day we were flying along and had the crew with us, and we saw a group of 3 male bears on an offshore spit. So Doug and I, we flew around, we talked to the other members of the crew, and we said, okay, so yes, the spit is big enough, and Doug is an experienced enough pilot. If we happen to drug one bear, we can keep it on the spit, keep it out of the water, and we'll have enough time to get the second bear. So we'll be able to catch 2 out of the 3. So that'll be really good. So we drugged the first bear, and the spit on the east side, it kind of had a bit of a bank, and then it sloped down like this towards the west. And on the east side of this spit, there were many, many large boulders, much more than in the background of this photograph here. And so when Doug and I, we dropped off the other crew members, and we talked about it, and we said, okay, once we drug the bear, obviously it's really important. We have to keep the bear out of those boulders because it's going to be impossible to handle it there. Anyway, so we drugged I managed to get a dart in the neck of the first bear, and things are going well. It starts to show the effects of the drug. It gets stumbly. And Doug is herding it with the helicopter, keeping it out of the boulders. And all of a sudden, at the last second, the bear is really stumbly and getting groggy. It runs a short distance and collapses amongst these boulders and is out. We say, well, darn. And we came down in the helicopter. I could see that the bear's nose was clear. There were no obstructions for his breathing. So even though it's going to be awkward for weighing the bear, et cetera, that's a good outcome. Okay, let's go get the second bear. So the second bear was still close enough. We got over, got a dart again, a nice dart into its neck. So it's well drugged, and Doug keeps it on the spit by circling it with the helicopter. And as we're talking about it, say, oh boy, we really need to keep these 2 bears apart. It'd be nice if they were fairly close, so we didn't have to carry the equipment too far in between bears, but let's keep them apart. Well, wouldn't you know it, the very last second, this bear charges in amongst these boulders, collapses down right on top of the first bear. And so as I see from the helicopter, I can see that the chin of the second bear is right on top of the skull of the first bear. I said, Doug, you got to land. Let me out. I got to go check this out. So Doug lands the helicopter, and I go running up to the bears. And I grabbed the second bear by the scruff of the neck, and I'm able to haul it off. A big bear, but I was able, I guess lots of adrenaline, able to haul it off the first bear. And then I realized that the first bear has gone down with a boulder right pressing against its larynx, against the Adam's apple. And that's been restricting breathing. So I look at the bear, I feel its nose, and it's not breathing. So I start to, not panic, but I'm getting pretty concerned. And as I'm feeling for a pulse, I can see the heart, essentially the movement of the heart against the rib cage. The bear's heart is still breathing. They're still working. So it's not dead. It's just not breathing. So it needs artificial respiration. So I don't know, those of you who are dog owners, probably your vet has taught you this, but if you need to give artificial respiration to a dog or a bear, or in this case, a big male polar bear, you need to grab its snout like this. You need to put your mouth completely over the snout of that bear, like this. And imagine the snout of a big polar bear is about this size. And you need to breathe for that bear. You need to blow up its nostrils. So I started doing that to get this bear back breathing and save its life. In the meantime, Doug had gone to get the other two crew members, and they came running up. We had a young fellow who had just started working with us that summer, just finished his master's the year before at University of Saskatchewan. So Lyle came running up, Marty, how can I help? I said, Lyle, okay, listen, I have to go get a reversal drug, but this is what I need you to do, what I've just been doing. Lyle had this horrified look on his face. And I said, Lyle, you got to do it. I have to go get reversal drug. And so Lyle said, okay. So Lyle, as a trooper, he did the same thing. He gave it about 2 more breaths. And by that time, that was enough. I'd been doing it for 2 or 3 minutes, and now Lyle did a couple more. The bear started breathing on its own, and we were able to save it. So a little lesson there about how things can go wrong in a hurry. But if you have the right training and the right attitude, you can get the bears out of it, get yourself out of it, but more importantly, save the bears. So, interesting story, I thought. Another big bear story. This is the actual bear that caused the problem. So this is another great big male. And so that's me in the red jacket, and the conservation officer who worked with me for many years, a fellow named Tim Moody. And this is the sort of happy outcome. But as I darted that bear, I got a dart in its neck. It really wasn't going out very well. So we thought, well, possibly the dart didn't inject properly. And so we better give it a second dart. And we did. Eventually the bear went down. But it took a while to go down, and I really was kind of uncomfortable with it. And anyway, as we approached, Tim was behind me with a shotgun on backup, and I had that long pole. And our protocol always was that we approach from the rear of the bear. And as you approach, one of the last reflexes the bears lose as they go under these anesthetics is a response to noise. So you yell to the bear, whoa, bear, etc. You clap your hands loudly and watch to see if the ears move, if there's any response, or if they happen to lift its head. Anyway, as we approached the bear, I said to Tim, this bear makes me a bit uneasy, just the way it was behaving. But we did all the right things, followed all the protocol, no response to noises. As we got close, I poked the bear in the rump with that fiberglass pole, no response. I worked my way up the back, again, no response. Bear wasn't moving its head, it looked fine. So I knelt down, and our protocol always was, if you kneel like a bear like this, before you're finally convinced that it's fully anesthetized, there's always a potential risk. So the procedure was that you would kneel down with a big bear like this and put your knee on it, one knee on its neck. And then you snap your fingers in the ears like this. Again, that's one of the last reflexes to go. And so I did that, and there was no response. And so I felt the bear's ear, and I noticed that there was a hole, and a healed hole in the ear. So I called to Tim, and I said, "Oh, Tim, the bear's been tagged before. There's a hole in its ear, but it's lost a tag." And he said, "Oh, interesting. Can you read the tattoo?" So the tattoo is on the underside of the lip. So I curled the lip up to read the tattoo, at which point the bear stood up and it went like this. And I jumped back. Actually, I was thrown back because I had my knee on the bear's neck. Fortunately, I had followed my own protocol. Bear threw me back. I started to run. Subsequently, I have this all resolved, back to the helicopter, get some drugs, walk up, and the bear was out sufficiently that we could actually approach on ground. We didn't have to start the helicopter up again. Gave it a top-up drug, and then now you see it. It's fully immobilized and out, and we're discussing the situation afterwards. When we got back to the helicopter, the pilot was laughing. He said, "I didn't know an old guy like you could run so fast." He said, "Did you know your knees were touching your chest?" I said, yeah, easy for you, standing back here 100 yards away. Anyway, that was the story of a big old bear that played possum. And the lesson for me was that I did forget the very last part of my protocol. So the last reflex that they lose is called the palpebral. So if you touch just in the corner of your eye like this, you will involuntarily, you will blink. And so that's the last reflex they lose. When they're no longer responding to sound, they will still respond. And I had forgotten to do that. Had I done that, I would have known he still wasn't. But anyway, important lesson that I remembered for many years. I should watch our time here. So females with cubs are a different handling thing altogether. We drug the adult female, but the cubs are too small to drug from the helicopter, so we approach them on the ground. We get a crew, we get people kind of surrounding them and approach slowly and hoping that the cubs will stay huddled on mom, and then drug them with a pole syringe. So get close enough to give them a jab in the neck with a pole syringe. So I'll watch my time here. I'll move on a bit. So I want to talk about a bit about in bears, the North American bears for sure, there's tremendous seasonal variability in body size. So this is a big male polar bear in August, actually. So he's only been off the ice about a couple of weeks. And I think you can see that he must have rolls and rolls of fat. Look how huge he is. This is not the same bear, but this is a similar sized male polar bear in October. And I think you can see how much skinnier he is. Look, he's lost all of that fat along, his ribs are almost showing, but you can see he's a big male. But look at this massive size of these forearms. Amazing seal killing machines, these guys. So that's normal variation in the year of a male polar bear from August until October. Bears are losing about 1 kilogram a day of body fat during that whole time. And of course, they're waiting for the ice to reform before they can go back. So with the polar bears, one of the many things we did was fit GPS collars on adult females. And we had a breakaway device on them that here, this breakaway was timed. It had 2 years, had an internal timer. At 2 years, this would separate and the collar would fall off. And some of the information that we got from these collars. Every one of these different colored spaghetti lines is the annual track of a female polar bear as she spent the time out on Hudson Bay. And you can see tremendous area. They move, anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 kilometers in a year, home ranges of 250 to 500,000 square kilometers. Phenomenal movement patterns. They den in the side of frozen structures such as this. This is a den dug in the side of a feature called a palsa. It's got ice core and then frozen peat on the outside, and the bears dig in the side of there. That's where they like to den. One of the things we learned from GPS collars was that bears quite often den in the middle of spruce stands. And they don't make much of a den at all. They simply have a scrape like this. They scrape up some sphagnum and they lay down in this really dense stand of spruces, end up in a big snow cave. And the spruces, of course, act kind of like a snow fence. They trap the snow, so the bear does end up deeply buried in snow. So here's a photograph taken by our ministry's caribou survey crew in February one year. They were flying along, flying transects, counting caribou, and they came across all these tracks. They sent me the photograph that night and said, Marty, what do you think we have here? And I think you can see all this dirty trail coming out here, lots of footprints around. And so I emailed them back and said, you found the den of a female polar bear. And this was near Attawapiskat, west of Attawapiskat in the James Bay area. And I said, is there any chance you can go back and get some close-ups? And they said, well, you know, our protocol is that the fixed-wing aircraft flies one day, and then the second day, the helicopter comes along. We randomly select in transects, and the helicopter verifies, because it's flying a lot slower, verifies what the fixed-wing people in the fixed-wing saw the day before. I said, any chance you could randomly select that transect? So they did, and it's a favor to me. And they went back the next day, and this is what they saw. So here's the female bear. You can see all of the sand and gravel and so on in her fur, and here are her two cubs. My grad student went back the following summer to where the den was, and you can see all the excavated peat that the female had dug out. The den was in here. The material over the actual entrance had actually collapsed in the summer, but that's where she was, den in there into peat. So in the Hudson Bay area, as I mentioned, females den inland, sometimes as far as 100 kilometers inland. Most of them are within about 40 to 50 kilometers of the shore, but some of them are farther inland. And the cubs are born probably in early December. And by the time the cubs are 2 to 3 months old, it's time for the female to head back to the ice with these young cubs, because she hasn't eaten since she came off the ice the previous July or possibly August. And she's lost a lot of body weight. She's produced these fetuses and these young cubs, but more importantly, she produced all of this milk. So it's a huge energetic drain on her. And here you see the tracks of a family group as they're heading back to the ice. Out on the hard-packed lake, the crust of the lake here, all you can see is the adult female's tracks, but actually back in the spruces where the snow is softer, you could see the tracks of the cubs. So the females head back to the ice, and immediately they're starting to hunt seals. And the ecological timing here is that female polar bears need to return to the ice when the seals are having their pups, because that's when there's abundant food for them. And so that's the ecological timing, and why, if you backtrack, why polar bear cubs are born in December. Females need to have cubs that are able to travel by the time they need to get back to the ice to hunt seals. Another quick story about polar bears. So this is a female that we darted one year, and fit with a collar. She wasn't in particularly good shape. And as we followed her movements in the fall, before the ice formed, we saw that she went back and forth along the coast of Agamaskie Island in James Bay. Back and forth, back and forth. She covers something like 400 kilometers back and forth. And ultimately, her collar went stationary down here somewhere in early December, just before the ice formed. The goose bending crew that went on the island in May and June found her. She had starved to death. So she wasn't in very good condition when we collared her in the fall. And she wandered back and forth on the island looking for ice, but the ice was late forming. And so ultimately she starved to death and never made it back onto the ice. One of the consequences of climate change for polar bears. Sometimes in in the summer and fall season, you'll see bears feeding on vegetation, a whole variety of things, but including vegetation like lime grass here. This is actually a shot from Churchill of a young bear feeding on lime grass. But their primary diet is ring seals and bearded seals. If they don't have access for extended periods of time over the winter and spring to ring seals and bearded seals, then they're really going to suffer. Primarily feeding on different times of the year on adult seals, but during that April-May period, really fattening up on newborn pups, and also on pups that have been weaned by their mother and are now sitting on top of the ice molting into their next fur. A couple of more things about polar bears before we end it here. This is the rear foot of a big male polar bear. And if you look closely at the pad, it might be hard to see in your photo, but there are a lot of papillae. So it's kind of, I think, analogous to the tube feet of a starfish. They're not as big as that, of course, but polar bears have all these papillae on the foot pads. And the interpretation is that these papillae help them when they're walking over hard-packed snow or ice. It helps them not slip. And this photo, again, is a little bit gruesome. This is a close-up of the lower jaw of a big male polar bear. And you can see on the right-hand side here, here's the bear's left-hand side, this canine, which is quite large, you can see. And on the right-hand side of the bear's jaw, the canine has been snapped off. And what we've learned over the years is that big male polar bears fight with each other aggressively over access to females. And as they get older, their teeth get brittle, presumably, as ours do. And occasionally they have a canine that snaps off like this in an encounter. And bears like this almost certainly have systemic bacterial infections, and that's probably an important cause of mortality for old male bears. All right, so the best place that you can actually see polar bears in Canada up close is in Churchill. This is a photo of a tundra buggy used by Frontiers North, for the travel companies in Churchill. Allows people to get up close to bears and see them in all kinds of interesting behaviors. Here's a female with a couple of cubs. Came across one day, she was sleeping. The young male cub apparently was bored, and he started playing with this length of branch, rolling around on his back, manipulating this branch with his back feet and front feet, chewing on it and having a good old time. And we watched him for about half an hour playing around like this, and eventually he went back to lying with mom. So we see bears in all kinds of different situations, staring wistfully out to the bay, waiting for the ice to form. Sometimes see them up pretty close. This old guy had a nickname. He was called Dancer. He's dead now, but when I first started going to Churchill in the early 2000s, he was around, and he would approach tundra buggies, and he would kind of stand up like this, and so that's how he got his nickname, Dancer, as he approached. And a pretty photogenic guy. You can see again that he's been in lots of fights, lots of scars all over his rostrum. He's been in lots of fights with other male bears for access to females. Similar to black bears, the bond between a female and her cubs is phenomenal. This is a female and a couple of yearlings in October one year. And the female in the middle, and the one cub rubbing up against her, making close contact, and the other one smelling her. Phenomenal. So one last thing about the polar bear before I wrap it up. One interesting thing that many people have seen is in the fall, as it gets closer to the time when freeze-up might happen, you often see encounters between male polar bears. And it's called sparring, and they go through these kind of wrestling matches. And in this shot, the male bear on the left here has challenged the guy on the right. And the guy on the right's not particularly interested, so he's trying to get away. But the other fellow pursues him. And ultimately, they engage in this kind of open mouth sparring like this, which is again is a display, trying to impress each other with their size. based on the size of their mouth gape. The guy on the left stands up and he challenges. Ultimately, the guy on the right kind of resigned, but he does eventually stand up, and they spar. It's interpreted that this is practice behavior for the time in April when they will be aggressively fighting with other males for access to females. And what I found is if you're really patient and you watch this carefully and for a long time, and if you can convince your tundra buggy driver to maybe stay out a bit longer than everybody else, then you might get a chance to see something that very few people get a chance to see. I've only ever seen this once or twice myself. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the presentation, folks, and thanks for your attention. And that's all I have for you. Thanks very much. Over to you, Samantha.
Thank you, Marty. Thanks for ending on that humorous note. That was great. We have tons of questions here, so I want to dig right in. One thing I want to note is I think you know someone in attendance. His name is Brad Fateau. He was the former managing director at Ontario Parks. He says, great presentation. Hope your retirement is going well. And he said he went out with you in Algonquin a few winters ago to do black bear monitoring, and it was incredible.
Yeah, hi, Brad. Nice to hear from you. Yeah, Brad was out with us one winter. That's great.
Margaret is wondering, I love nature, hiking, and camping, but I find my enjoyment is often tarnished by a fear of a black bear attack. Is there anything you can tell her to sort of relax her fears?
Well, the reality is that occasionally there are attacks. That's true, but they're very rare. And what you can do, I'm not sure what Margaret's camping experiences are, but if you're camping out in the wilderness where you don't expect anybody else has camped there before, you need to check your surroundings, make sure that it's clean. You need to keep a really clean camp because you don't want to attract black bears yourself. But what you can do, apart from being aware of your surroundings and making sure you have a clean camp, watching for bear sign. If you see bear sign at a particular campsite, droppings or whatever, then move. But the other thing that you can do, and this is really, really important, is that it's well documented that pepper spray, bear spray, is effective at deterring black bears, grizzly bears, and polar bears. So if you're camping in black bear country, make sure that you buy some pepper spray, that you carry it on your person, on your belt, that you have access to it, that you know how to use it. And if you do end up in an aggressive encounter with a bear, that you have something that will save you from injury and save your life. That's the best thing that you can do, and that's well documented in several publications.
Okay, Margaret is wondering, what are the main causes of mortality in bear cubs?
So, well, one important cause of mortality is when there's a food failure. So if a cub is born in January, and let's say mom is not in particularly good shape, and the food fails that summer, say the blueberry crop fails and the mountain ash crop fails, maybe the raspberries aren't very good, mom is not going to be able to produce much milk, and so cubs quite often starve to death. They dwindle away. They starve to death that summer. Or in a case of that really small weight yearling I showed you, it might survive for the first year and a half, but then as soon as it's independent, it will starve to death. So that's one really important source of mortality. The other is that other predators such as wolves and lynx get bear cubs, but also other bears. Big male bears occasionally, it would be selected against for a big male bear to kill his own cubs. Obviously, if he encountered a female with cubs, let's say he mated with a female in June, and the following May he encounters a female with cubs, he needs to have some way of knowing whether those are likely to be his cubs or not. And I guess that it's all based on scent. Now, when my dad was still alive, he lived in England, and he came over once a year for a visit. He only had to just come to the front door of the house, and my dogs just at one sniff and immediately recognized him. So I don't see any reason why that can't work with bears as well. That males would recognize the scent of a female they may have mated with. But it's also to their advantage to remove the cubs of some other male from the population. So that's where males end up killing cubs. But starvation, killing by other predators such as wolves and lynx, and occasionally bears. Those are the major causes of mortality.
Great, thank you. Once cubs leave their mother, do they continue to interact with her? Like, is there any sort of continued affection with the original family?
Yeah, so female yearlings tend to stay close to the home range of their mother. And when we look at a population of radio-collared bears, and you follow their movements over several years, you see that the older females kind of adjust the location of their home range, and they may move over a little bit to allow their daughters to occupy a piece of the country that is adjacent to them. So those females continue to interact over the years. And I have a good friend and colleague named Terry DeBryan who actually studied habituated bears in Michigan for several years. He had in their open country there, kind of like the forest of Algonquin, where there's not a lot of understory. He could maintain visual contact with bears, and eventually got them so used to his presence that he could follow them for 24-hour stretches at a time. And he would see those females scent marking. So their scent mark on the outskirts of their home range, but also he saw them interacting with their daughters in subsequent years. So yes, there's interaction later on amongst mothers and daughters and granddaughters, etc., and half sisters. But the males leave, and males often disperse 200 or 300 kilometers away from the area that they were born. So they would no longer interact with their mother, in contrast to their sisters.
Wow, that's interesting. Onto polar bears. Is it true that when polar bears are becoming stressed, you know that by yawning?
Yeah, so that's it's not one of the early signals in this whole increasing stress response. I didn't talk about that one, but that's true. It's kind of a displacement, what's called a displacement behavior. So the bear's not really sleepy, but it's unhappy with a certain situation. And so I've seen both polar bears and black bears do that. It's a fairly low level of stress, but it still indicates that the bear's uncomfortable with whatever's happening at the time.
Great, thank you. Diana's also wondering, when GPS collars on the female polar bears broke away, were you able to retrieve them?
Samantha, it was a little broken up. Could you repeat the last part of that?
Sure. Were you able to retrieve those collars that broke off the polar bears?
Yeah, so if they broke off on schedule, we would have them timed so that we expected that the bear would be in a den. So bears in the study area where we worked in Ontario, the females would go into dens in November typically. So by early December, they would be in a den. So we had those drop-offs set to fire on the 1st of December. And, in theory, the female would already be in her den. The collar would drop off in the den. And then the following summer, we could go into the field by helicopter, go to the location and recover the collar from the den. And at the same time, we would be able to get all that information on the den location, the kind of habitat it was in, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, we were able to recover them if they worked properly, which mostly they did.
Ava's wondering, how do polar bears navigate in total darkness?
Well, the speculation is that they must use the stars. And as you're suggesting, especially in the high Arctic, where there are months with no sun visible at all, then they must be using the stars or electromagnetic radiation. Nobody really knows, but the guess is more than likely the stars.
Great. A few people are asking about climate change and how that's affecting polar bears. So as the ice recedes, do you see bears going north to follow the ice and change their territory, or what?
Yeah, that's an interesting question that I've been asked many times, actually. So if you think about Hudson Bay, those bears that live in the southern part of Hudson Bay, so Ontario and Manitoba, there's roughly 900 bears in Ontario, roughly 900 in Manitoba. So getting close to a couple of thousand bears. Well, why don't they just all move to the northern part of Hudson Bay where there might still be ice? Well, the problem is there's already bears there. So all the areas where polar bears currently exist are essentially full of bears. And if that habitat could sustain more bears, it would. But there are really good reasons, and it's the connection between the abundance of prey and the number of bears that can support that limit the number of bears in a given area. So if an area, say Fox Basin or Baffin Bay or wherever, the high Arctic, Lancaster Sound, if that area can support 2,000 bears, that'll be about how many is there. So that area can't support another 1,000. So no, we don't expect bears that will be able to. The bears will be able to simply move. A few may, but most of them will not. They will show fidelity to wherever they currently are, and eventually they will dwindle away.
Thank you. Ava's also wondering, is it possible to go with a biologist to view black bears? There used to be someone in the US that offered that option.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking. It's probably Lynn Rogers. He has a facility in Minnesota where he has people come to his facility. So that's possible. Contact him. I don't have contact information off the top of my head. He has a facility there where he has bears that are habituated and come in. People hand feed them, etc. They're anyway. Some people have ethical concerns about that. But in terms of research projects, most of us who worked on black bears over many years took many people with us in the field. Brad mentioned earlier that when he was director of Ontario Parks, he'd been out with us 1 year, and we used to take whole classes of students from the Bancroft Secondary School from their environmental studies course. We would have a class of 30 students. We would operate 2 crews. Maybe 15 would go with one crew and 15 with another. So we would quite often do that, and I know that people in Minnesota and other jurisdictions where they have an active winter program, they take people out often to give them the experience and let them see bears up close and perhaps learn to appreciate bears a bit better.
That's great. It's always about doing it ethically. Margaret is wondering, how common are predatory bears in Ontario?
Oh, very rare. The last fatality we had in Ontario was 2005. There was if you remember that story, it was north of Chapleau. It was a young doctor from Cambridge who was killed. So very rare. There have been a few attacks over the years, but that was the last one. That was quite a while ago.
That's good news for us. Sandra wanted to say, I saw 2 young males spar in Churchill, and I actually have it on video. We also saw the helicopter transfer of a mom and 3 cubs from the bear jail in Churchill, where every Canadian should be, she says. Tell me more about this bear jail in Churchill. I keep hearing about it.
So Manitoba Conservation over the years has developed a really active program where they work to reduce human polar bear conflict within the town of Churchill. So if they get a bear that's in town, is likely to be a problem, or any bear in town is a problem because there's so many people around. They will trap that bear or drug it, dart it, and take it to what colloquially is known as the polar bear jail. It's a holding facility, has a number of pens inside it, and they'll capture the bear, drug it, they take it anesthetized, put it into its own pen separate from others, and keep it there for a number of weeks. If it's not a particularly busy season, they'll keep whatever bears they have there until the ice starts to form on Hudson Bay, and then they'll fly the bears out by helicopter. Usually they fly them north of town, across the river and north, and release them there, close to where the ice is forming. So I forget the exact, I think they can have, I think it's 23 bears total in that facility at any one time. If it's a busy fall, they might just keep a bear for a few weeks, and then they might move it. So yeah, so that's what that facility is for.
Interesting. So I hear that you are the tour leader for Polar Bears of Churchill, a tour with Quest Nature Tours in November 2021. And that's where you'll, will you see the polar bear jail?
It really depends. It's you know, it's a busy time of year when we're there for the Manitoba conservation people. So if it's really busy and they're out, you know, deterring bears or whatever, they don't have time to take groups through the polar bear handling facility. So what we are able to do is take people to show them the facility, and then Manitoba Conservation has some display boards outside to talk a little bit about the facility and what it's for. And you know, I can talk to people about that, but typically we're not able to, the members of the public are not able to see inside the facility itself.
Got it. Okay, so it's a lot of tundra buggy explorations, seeing those photos of the bears. And then in June of 2021, you have a Svalbard Explorer cruise, and there will be lots of polar bears there. That one's sold out, so we're going again with you in June of 2022. So we'll look out for that. Do you have anything else to add, Marty?
No, that was great. I enjoyed this. It was fun for me to be able to tell some stories and you know, not rely a whole lot on presenting hard data slides. So that was fun. And I love whoever's thinking about coming to Churchill. It's a great experience. We always have a good time there and enjoy staying at the Northern Study Center and interacting with other scientists there and the students. Good time.
Wonderful. Thank you for your time, Marty. We really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.